Today we're going to talk about how mindfulness supports well-being and employee engagement, and we're going to do it through a psychological approach. So who am I? So I started off in people analytics at Deutsche Bank. I actually was one of the founding members of their people analytics team. I was a collegiate athlete. I played sports my whole life. And my second phase of life, I went back for a master's in sports psych and was hired by the New York Mets to do traditional mental skills, sports psychology endeavors. But along the way, I was offered an opportunity to look at the analytics side as well. So where I'm at right now is, I still support professional teams and collegiate teams on their mental skills side, but I've sort of married it back with the people analytics. And if you think about whether it's being hired in corporate or being drafted by a team, everyone's looking at the back of your trading card. They're all looking at those stats about you, right? Your resume is all stats about your ROI on whatever your experiences have been. For athletes, it's all about, what your on-base percentage is, or what are your achievements from an outcome perspective. And what I'm doing is adding the front of that trading card. Who are you? Your personality traits. What are your behavioral traits? Those character traits that allow you to express your maximum potential consistently. There's a machine learning platform that I use so that it debiases, very similar actually to Ian's, if you were in his speech earlier today. And then there's a culture map too. So it's understanding if, when, and how someone's going to be successful in a given environment. So for today, our goals. So I want to just go over like a brief employee engagement review, assuming many people in this room already understand it. Talk a little bit about mindfulness and how we're going to map engagement to mindfulness. All right, so who do we have to thank for this employee engagement stuff? And there's a short little history up there that discusses how the term employee engagement was first thought of and how it's evolved and become a little bit more comprehensive. And it's that last one in 2006 where you're looking at the characterizations of vigor, dedication, and absorption, which match to the physical, emotional, and cognitive as well that we're going to be focusing on today. So when you think about the engagement characteristics, you're talking about the organization level and the individual level as well, as many of you know. And the research has demonstrated that in the organization, those three key components, senior management's feedback, how the feedback is grounded, and the human capital investments are the most effective ways of building positive, active engagement. On the individual side, the three areas that are noted up there are the areas in which individuals learn and start to achieve the most positive engagement. Anyone have any thoughts or comments? Anyone's experiences tend to suggest something different? Okay. So some stats, which again, assuming many of you are aware of, but engagement isn't as great as we think it is. Obviously, it's a hot topic right now. And what's interesting is noticing that the actively engaged in the US versus global, and then there's a global breakdown there as well. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But the numbers are pretty stark, right? You've got a lot of apathy out there. And there's a lot of room to move some of those people over into the actively engaged, but also understand why people are disengaged and how to bring them over into the engagement area. So that's part one, right? We defined and described how we think about employee engagement and the workplace impact as we see it from a statistical standpoint. Any comments, thoughts, questions? Anyone sort of see it differently? I thought like that part we could sort of get through pretty quickly. Okay. So mindfulness. Okay, so I'm sure on some level we've all heard of it, maybe we've tried it, experienced it in some way, shape, or form. And the concept is, that idea of being present. And it's establishing the thoughts, feelings, and behavior connection of no judgment. Okay, so some points up there is it's that state of being aware and being able to attend to without necessarily having to take action. Okay, so when you are typically not mindful, there's a reaction going on, right? And so in the workplace, it is triggered by a lot of things, both internally and externally. Oftentimes, we're bringing things outside of the workplace into the workplace, and that can have a positive and or negative impact. But again, it's that a lack of mindfulness in the moment that allows those thoughts to impact the emotions and the feelings and direct our behaviors in the non-engagement way. So I think that it's pretty obvious to think about ways in which like that would be helpful and or harmful in the workplace. We've probably experienced it ourselves, both as it's being directed to us, but also as the person who's doing it, unfortunately, sometimes as well. So from an impact perspective, there's that internal and then there's the external impact. And when we're thinking about what is happening when we're being mindful, well, let's take a moment to just talk about the neuroscience, the cognitive things that are going on inside. So we all have this limbic system that drives a lot of our flight or fight, right? It's pretty familiar territory for a lot of us. And when we are in this reactive state, or in general, when we receive a stimuli, positive or negative, the first thing that goes off is our amygdala saying, or what do we do here? I need to protect myself. What have I mapped over the years to recognize this as, and how can I come back and really protect myself, my ego? And as we start to use breath work, as we start to incorporate different modalities of mindfulness, we engage the prefrontal cortex. It's up here, our executive function, and it allows us to stop and press pause on what's going on in our amygdala and say, wait, hold on a second. This may not be necessary after all. And that's really important because the more times you practice it, the more that you're actually building that brain gray matter, and it becomes more automatic for this to kick in versus for the flight or fight or freeze response to kick in. So as a result, you have a lot of really great things happening, both internally and also externally, right? And what's really kind of fun about the diversity and inclusion piece that we if some of you were in here before, is that it sort of melts together really nicely, right? Inclusion sort of implies us a desire to have well-being, and the idea of how do we make our one self better so that we can be better for each other. And mindfulness is a really great way to start to recognize how we can control that. And even the way we did an exercise about reframing a negative situation into a positive that led to a strength or wisdom, this is really another great example of how you can develop that reframing and how you can use reframing to lead to some of these positive impacts. Any questions, thoughts, comments? Cool. Okay, so what else can happen when you're mindful? Well, it's self-actualization, right? We're all evolving. We're all people starting to understand ourselves, and at some point, typically around our 40s, you start to hit that reflective stage where you're like, what is my impact? What's my legacy? What am I even doing here? That's what I say to my kids all the time. So what I have up here are on the right side is the individual, and that's really Maslow's hierarchy, right? And that's sort of a very well understood psychological framework of where you want to end up in life, how you want to achieve that purpose and that meaning. On the left side, on the organization side, now you're saying, well, how can this be reflected internally in the organization? So, and in the middle is positive psychology's PERMA model. And in active engagement and positive engagement, we're starting to see a lot of positive psychology come into play. Why? Because positive psychology suggests that happiness is more than obtainable. It's just the natural result of building up our well-being and our satisfaction with life. So it really makes sense that it would be incorporated into understanding how you as an individual can self-actualize, how the organization itself can as well, but also build that within all the individuals together and independently. So when you're talking about engagement on the PERMA chart, and you see that it underneath the descriptors, finding flow. So in sports, we talk about how you're in the zone. And there's a lot of different things that are happening psychologically, but at the end of the day, it's mindfulness. You're acting on automatic, where you're not analyzing, you're not thinking, you're not reacting, you're just being. And in that moment, that idea of finding flow is a direct link to motivation. So setting it up. So now I wanted to connect what we looked at before on the individual side and the individual engagement side and the mindfulness component of self-actualization. So where are the bright spots in connecting the left side and the right? So where do you see the ability in yourself, and if you're a leader for other people, when you're doing personal development, when you're doing the annual performance review, when you're looking at social relationships, and some of that can be looked at through an O&A perspective, some of it can just be your own self-reflection, and how that's helping you achieve those different levels of the basic needs, psychological needs, and self-fulfillment needs on the hierarchy scale. So understanding how you can connect what the research and the evidence is suggesting leads to engagement for yourself, and where you're finding where you're stuck on that pyramid. Why are you stuck there? Is it okay to be there for now? And what sort of levers do you need to understand better and communicate so that you can build your own character strengths and character traits, but also ask for and advocate for within the player development or in learning and development internally. Any comments, questions? Does that make sense? Great. So if we looked at that on the individual side, now we're going to say, all right, well, clearly on the organizational side, we have to understand that there's a connection as well. And where do we see these two coming together and overlapping in a positive way? What's working so that we can actually build the actualization and the engagement and innovation that derives self-fulfillment on the individual level? So that's putting together, on the one hand, engagement and the research that supports what creates the active engagement, and the layer of mindfulness that is looking at a person internally and saying, all right, from a psychology standpoint, how are we actually benefiting the whole person? We're done with that one. Anyone have any questions, comments? No? Okay. So let's start to bring this together, and we do that through understanding motivation. So a motivated mindset. So in motivation theory, one of the most standard ways to describe it is through self-determination theory and the acronym CAR. So you're looking at competency, autonomy, and relatedness. So, and I left the PERMA model sort of transparent off to the left because you'll start to understand how it bleeds into and connects to developing self-confidence and efficacy. So when you're talking about self-determination theory and how do you build internal motivation, right? How do you build that intrinsic drive that says, I'm doing it because I actually enjoy doing it? It's great to have a balance of extrinsic and intrinsic. It's not just all about being intrinsically motivated. It's not realistic, and it's probably not healthy. It's okay to have the extrinsic motivations, but as we're all understanding through engagement now, we need more than just the financial incentive. We need more of the moral and self-actualization incentive. So how do we get that from our employees? So you have competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So this triangle is actually a secondary part of self-determination theory. And you're looking at an agent, means, and ends. Okay, so you're the agent, you have the means, you're trying to get to the end. And the competence are your belief system that says, I know I can lift the weights to build muscles, right? The contingency beliefs is, I actually have the right weights in the exercise room that are gonna get me the muscles I need. So I have the right skill set to go out and perform this job, and the organization is providing me with what I need to actually be able to execute. And then the control belief is that if I do it, I'm going to actually achieve it. So when you think about those components from not only an employee perspective, but also from an employer perspective, and now we start to think about what are we really doing to engage people, it's important to start to understand that on a human level, we have to encourage people to have the competence, to give them the strategy, and to allow them to participate in the execution of it. Does that make sense? Great. So the one piece that isn't up there is the relatedness. And that relatedness on the PERMA model is through relations. And that's really how you are connecting not only with the people around you, but with the purpose and the mission. And that we're seeing a lot when we talk about culture. That's what we're seeing a lot when we're talking about mission-driven statements. And what's really great when you start to think about it in terms of yourself is if you can step into a place where you feel like you can automatically relate to the underlying premise, chances are you are going to feel intrinsically motivated and feel like what you're doing makes a difference. Because if you're not feeling that relatedness, then you're also not feeling like what you're going to be doing is purposeful. And some of that other stuff starts to not necessarily break down, but just have less relevance. It starts to fade a little bit. And so when you're thinking about like, okay, so I know I have a skill set, but we're also talking about not just the hard skills, but also the character traits and the behavioral skills as well. And I think that the company is able to support it, and I think I have what it takes. I think I have the strategy that if I have those tools there, that I'm going to be able to do something with it. And it's important now to understand, well, how did that happen, right? How come I might feel like I have the competency and that I have autonomy and I get along with everyone, and the person next to me does as well, but why are they not feeling as engaged as I am? And that gets into a really important point, which is context, right? And that's the framework by which we've actually developed our strengths. So when I work with teams and I have the machine learning platform that helps identify and debias their 5-factor personality traits, there's also just a generic qualitative side. You can't get rid of the scouts, right? It would be great to think about like just automating everything. And on the corporate side, there probably are a couple platforms that do it and that claim that they can do it. But there's a very real component to understanding and how to get the storytelling out of a person. So you can say, well, listen, they built resiliency and this is how they built it. So we feel like it's going to translate in here. It's a risk assessment. Or this person really knew how to overcome adversity, but it seems like we might be heading for a little bit of trouble. It might be a little bit uphill because of the way that our culture is built here. So if you can understand some of those ways in which those character traits, those personalities, how that was really structured and framed for oneself, now you can start to say, how do we actually maximize that self-determination theory? How do we maximize getting people to feel competent? How do we maximize people in taking the contingency belief and actually creating and executing on it? Make sense? Cool. So when we first talked about going way back now on the individual side, you were looking at these three areas that lead to the engagement. So when we think about, all right, so I need positive social relationships, sounds like relatedness. I need a personal development plan, which sounds like contingency. I need annual formal performance appraisal focusing on strengths, that's the competence. That's just what it is. So that very naturally maps, the research maps to motivation theory. Okay, so let's put it all together. So this was our well-being takeaway, right? This was the research that said, here's what we found in a meta-analysis that led to engagement, positive engagement. Okay, great. Now what do we do with it? Well, let's actually put it to the whole person. Let's really try to get people and our organization to a state of self-actualization. How do we do that? We look at engagement through motivation, through positive psychology and understanding motivation theory, so that you can also build not only for the person that's in the workplace, but who they're going to be outside of the workplace. And it goes back full circle. If you're going to be able to do things better outside of the workplace, you're also going to be better inside of the workplace. And so this is just another sort of representation of some of the concepts we discussed. So in mindfulness, you're looking at thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. When we were looking at the work engagement scale initially through those definitions, we were talking about cognitive, emotional, and physical. And then the characteristics from the most recent definition was looking at absorption, dedication, and vigor. So when you stop and, this is basically what I was putting together through the research and just through some of the psychology pieces, is it really does just naturally map over and lay over each other. But how often do we stop and think about that's why things work? That's maybe why what we're implementing can work better or isn't working, is when you really look at it from the whole person, from the psychology of why they're in there in the first place and where they want to be and where you want to be. So when you're thinking about your own self, like knowing your why can evolve over time, but at the end of the day, if you have the motivation, and let's just call through the intrinsic standard self-determination theory, if you have that, then you're going to be able to say, all right, this is deriving passion and joy through what I do. So I don't have to worry about this leading to something reactive, leading to a negative behavior, right? Instead, you're going to be so absorbed, you're going to have the dedication where you're not worried about leaving the office, and the vigor is the stamina and the idea of the resiliency to just push through whatever the bureaucratic crap is that we deal with on a daily basis in our workplaces to continue on. Because now you're doing it for something internal versus the external. That's it. Any questions or comments? Any sort of thoughts on maybe anyone want to call BS and say, you know what, I hear you, but it doesn't work in our place? Because it would be interesting for me to understand if people have sort of taken this approach or if they think it would or wouldn't work. Yeah.
I agree with your approach completely. Have you measured it though? Like, how do you quantitatively track some of the behavior?
Well, to me, what makes sense is then when you look at, well, what are the positive attributes of having engaged people, right? First of all, positive engagement has been shown to be a better predictor of financial success versus the actual past success of a company. So if you have positive engagement in, let's say, 2019, it's a better predictor of your financial performance in 2021 than the historical financial. So you're looking at the financial bottom line, right? So let's just start with what the business wants, right? At the end of the day, even sports teams, right? Oh yeah, we'd love to have a great athlete that's a great person. We want them to perform. We need to win, right? So companies the same way. They still need to make money. So this is all well and good, but yes, so it's through the financials. Then you're just looking at what do the financials break down into, what categories? And we're looking at retention. You're looking at how training and development expenses go. You're looking at how easy it is to acquire the talent versus have to spend the money going out and resourcing and finding the right talent pool. So those are I would say the measurements come in the way that we're looking to have engagement deliver its outcomes. Yes?
I also agree with this.
It's a great question. So the comment was, it's all well and good, but how do you really implement it, get it started, and has anyone done it? So I don't know anyone that's done it full blast. I think has anyone in this room done it? Okay, so it's not a one size fits all. My recommendation would be that you beta test it in a small pool that you know is going to be receptive and look for bright spots that you can then sort of, it's like user acceptance testing, right? You kind of do it through an iterative process. However, part of it is, again, understanding the company's culture, understanding what approach to mindfulness as opposed to like, let's all just sit down in a circle and close our eyes. There's a lot of variety and creative ways to do it, and it can be done individually or in small groups. So I know that's vague. I think in a nutshell, the answer is I don't know of a company that's done it like this. If someone were to try it, I think they'd have to start first and foremost with understanding the culture, both on the individual level but organization level. And 3, be creative and not just have a blanket like we're going to roll this out. Yes?
So I think you alluded to, so I'm sort of looking for that parallel.
Sure. Okay. So how do you create the motivation when there isn't just a quick outcome feedback? How many people are you talking about? And how big is this group?
Well, I'm just talking
in
about
general?
The generic sort of large employee populations where you can't break down everything that they do into a pursuit or a mission. So the broader employee context, I guess.
So part of it is just taking a step back and perhaps looking at things a little bit generically from intrinsic and extrinsic, right? So if you understand your team and your team's composition and the balance therein, what are some ways that you can intrinsically motivate some of those individuals and extrinsically as well? A lot of it comes through the idea of feedback and communication. And I know that sounds very trite and generic. However, I don't know that it's done well. And that's the difference, is where you have people who are asking the open-ended questions, but actually listening and then being able to implement. Because I think I know actually that, and the research will demonstrate that the employees that feel like they're heard, right? That's that agent ends, where you feel like what you say matters and has an impact. When it doesn't, you stop talking and you stop sharing. So the idea I would start with is that you need to look at just the 2 motivational levers and have the communication. And you have to have the relationship and trust. And that should be there in place in the first place, right? In play to begin with. Yes?
So my organization sort of kind of has a mindfulness program.
Yeah, that's a great question. So can you create intrinsic motivation through an extrinsic onboarding? And essentially, the answer is yes, you can. Because the idea is, and the thought that popped in my head is gamification. You can gamify this. And whether it's through a tangible well-being approach or you literally create an app or an internal team game, right? The idea is you onboard through some sort of extrinsic, but at the end of the day, you're tapping into a more altruistic behavior that solicits a habit that has different levels to it, right? And those levels from the intrinsic standpoint is this idea of achieving more mindfulness. But on the extrinsic, it is maybe some sort of recognition or some sort of reward that is equally as motivating from that side of the organization and individual. But absolutely, I think that's how a lot of us sort of take the bait in a way. And so I have a specialization in gamification. So I think it's always fun to think about things in these clever ways. And that's sort of the way a lot of us are shifting anyway, whether we're looking at our strengths and how we want to use them intelligently. that's one way we can sort of encourage people to understand their strengths, build them, and continue to grow them. I saw one more hand. Anyone else?
I was just going to comment, but
Yeah.
I want to be respectful of the time. But I
Yeah,
was going to comment that, to the gentleman's question also, that, manager capability and culture play a really big part around mindfulness. And how do you create capabilities for managers around mindfulness also in building trust and so forth. And I think that dialogue around some of those softer behaviors, it's not just in the classroom. Right? It's got to be reinforced through multiple ways, and it's just something that I think when you're talking about kind of dynamics of the changing workplace, it's becoming more critical, and I'm not sure how much we're doing to help build those manager capabilities and being capable.
For sure. And same is true in sports, in a very parallel way. I'm around. I'll be around later on today, but thank you. Thanks for attending and participating.